the full preamble, but the recording is in progress, so it's being hosted by the National Reentry Resource Center. And by joining this meeting, you consent to such recordings, and any participant who prefers to participate via audio only should disable the video camera, so only the audio will be captured, and then video and or audio recordings of any AIR sessions shall not be transmitted to an external party without the permission of AIR. So we are hoping to take this recording and make it available after the session for those who weren't able to attend, and then also for people to be able to check back in. There's a lot of content that we're looking forward to sharing, and a lot of interesting information and access to new data tools that we are glad to have the opportunity to share. So thanks very much. If you want to go to the next slide. So again, my name is Rich Kluckow. I'm with the Bureau of Justice Statistics in the Correctional Statistics Unit. And we are thrilled to be part of Second Chance Month, which is in April this year. And BJS is an agency within OJP, of which BJA, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, is a sister agency who help individuals, communities, and agencies across the country to recognize the importance of reentry and their role in building second chances. If you are interested on staying up to date on everything that's going on this month, and there's a very full calendar of excellent activities and presentations, you can also stay tuned using the hashtags below, Reentry Matters, Second Chance Month, and Second Chance Month 22. If you tweet anything and want to tag it as such so that others can be involved and hear your responses and kickstart that conversation, please go ahead and do that. So I am thrilled to get to present the presenters of our session today. All statisticians at the Bureau of Justice Statistics working across a number of different units, but all working under this rubric of reentry, recidivism, and second chances. So we have Leonardo Antenangeli, a statistician. We have Carson, statistician, Matt Durose, and Danielle Kaeble. So the agenda for today, we are going to cover a wide range of different topics and work that we are engaged in. The first will be to present findings from recidivism studies of persons who are released from state prison in 2008 and 2012. The two cohorts tracked over a very long time window to be able to see their outcomes and persistence and how they fared after being released from state prison. Second, we will discuss a report on employment of persons who were released from federal prison in 2010. And this was a very interesting data linkage exercise where we were able to connect data across various entities and be able to provide a really interesting, in-depth analysis of the post-incarceration employment for people who released from federal prison. And finally, we'll round it out with a demonstration of a new correction statistical analysis tool that we're really excited about at BJS that allows for researchers and practitioners and stakeholders and people who are interested to be able to see a whole range of different really important demographic indicators and other types of information about people who released from prison. And so we're looking forward to presenting all of those to you. So just as a reminder, if you do have your microphone on, if you wouldn't mind putting that to mute while we're presenting, and that would help just to keep the airwaves clear. So take a quick look at your phone. If you've got it off mute, drop it on mute, and that'll help it be easier for everyone to hear. If you have any questions during the presentation, if you look at the bottom right of your screen, there's a panel options with 3 dots. If you click on that, it opens up a Q&A, and that would be a great place for you to put information and to ask questions, and we will come to those at the end of the session. Carol, I think your mic is live. You might want to hit on that. And so if you drop them into that, that'd be perfect. Or you can also chat in the window too, and Felicia and I will be able to connect, and we will hope to answer those questions at the end. So with all of that, thank you again for being here, and I'd like to turn it over to Matt Durose to kick us off.
Thank you, Rich, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. As Rich mentioned, during the first presentation, we'll be discussing findings from two recent Bureau of Justice Statistics studies on the recidivism of persons released from state prison. These findings provide a unique opportunity to examine recidivism at the national level. I will first be discussing how recidivism was measured and the method used for conducting the research. My colleague will then discuss key findings from these studies and how the most recent recidivism rates compare to those from previous BJS studies. Since the mid-1980s, BJS recidivism studies have been a primary source of national-level recidivism statistics. And the recent studies provide new insight on this very important topic. The first study we'll be discussing today is on prisoners released in 2012 with a 5-year follow-up period. It was based on the largest sample for a BJS recidivism study to date. The second study looks at persons released from state prison in 2008 with a 10-year follow-up period, the longest follow-up period for a BJS recidivism study. So recidivism can be and is defined and measured different ways. For BJS's recidivism studies, there's been primary use of 3 measures, including an arrest, conviction, or return to prison. So recidivism measure or definition needs to have 3 common traits: a starting event, such as being placed on probation or being released from prison, an outcome measure, such as a subsequent conviction or return to prison, and the third trait is a follow-up period, from the date of the start event to a predefined end date, such as 3 years. So just to provide a little bit of an overview of the previous BJS recidivism studies, BJS's first recidivism study was conducted in the mid-'80s, looking at persons released from state prison in 1983. It included a 3-year follow-up period. About 10 years later, a new national recidivism study was conducted on persons released from state prisons in 1994, which also included a 3-year follow-up period. The third national recidivism study was conducted on state prisoners released in 2005. The study first included a 5-year follow-up period, but then a further analysis was done to include a 9-year follow-up period to provide new insights on recidivism patterns. And as I mentioned, most recently, BJS has conducted recidivism studies on state prisoners released in 2008 with a 10-year follow-up period, and prisoners released in 2012 with a 5-year follow-up period. BJS uses a combination of prisoner records and criminal history data to conduct its recidivism studies. The prisoner records provide data on prisoners' date of release, demographic characteristics, commitment offense, and sentence length. And the criminal history data includes information on arrests, convictions, and incarcerations both prior to and following the date of release. The data also include events within and outside the state where the person was released from prison. I'll now go ahead and hand the presentation over to my colleague, Leonardo.
Thanks, Matt. So the first study I'm going to be discussing today is that of persons released from prison in 2012. Now, this study in particular had 34 states in the study, and as Matt mentioned, this is the largest sample of prisoners to date. These are the 34 states that were able to provide prison records needed to obtain the criminal history data on these people. And these 34 states together accounted for 79% of all prisoners released nationwide that year. Now, among the more than 400,000 state prisoners released in 2012, 89% of them were male, and the remaining 11% were female. White prisoners accounted for the largest percentage of prisoners at 44%, followed by Black prisoners at 36% and Hispanics at 16%. American Indian and Alaska Native and others accounted for 2% each, and finally Asian, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islanders made up the remaining 1%. Half of the prisoners were ages 25 to 39 at the time of release. Another approximately a third of them were 40 or older, and the remaining were 24 or younger. The median age at time of release in 2012 was 33 years. About 1 in 4 prisoners were serving time for a violent offense, and an equal percentage were serving time for a property offense. A few less, or 26%, were serving time for a drug offense, and finally 19% were serving time for a public order offense. Now, for prisoners serving time for more than one offense, the one with the longest sentence length is the one that's reported here. So 43% of the prisoners had 10 or more prior arrests in their criminal history, whereas 31% had 5 to 9 and 26% had 4 or fewer prior arrests. So this figure here shows 3 different measures of recidivism, which Matt alluded to earlier. And we see here at the end of the 5-year follow-up period, 71% of persons released in 2012 had at least 1 arrest, 54% had a new conviction, and 46% had a parole or probation violation or a new sentence that led to a return to prison. I'll add a note here too that these figures include out-of-state information. So it does include information for those who were arrested outside of the state that released them. We see here also that younger persons were arrested at higher rates than their older counterparts following release in 2012. So 81% of those who were age 24 or younger had an arrest at the end of the 5-year follow-up period, compared to 74% who were 25 to 39 and 61% who were 40 or older. Similarly, those that had more prior arrests in their criminal histories were also rearrested at higher rates. And we see here at the end of the 5-year follow-up period, those with 10 or more prior arrests, 81% of those were rearrested at the end of the period, compared to 55% who had 4 or fewer prior arrests. This study also examined types of offenses for which persons released in 2012 were arrested during the follow-up period. Overall, 71% were arrested for any type of offense, and this overall figure includes those who were arrested for more than one type. Breaking it down into the 4 major offense categories, you see that 28% were arrested for a violent offense, 36% for property, about a third for a drug, and just over half for a public order offense. Now, beyond some of these measures that we've discussed, we also looked at recidivism from other perspectives. For example, about 10% of those persons released in 2012 were arrested within 5 years or within the 5-year follow-up period outside of the state that released them. There was an estimated 1.1 million arrests during the 5-year follow-up period among the more than 400,000 persons released in 2012. Now, the annual arrest percentage, which looks at the percent of all persons released in 2012 who were arrested during a particular year in the 5-year follow-up period, declined from 37% in year 1 to 26% in year 5. I'm going to turn now briefly to the second report that Matt mentioned, which looked at state prisoners released in 2008. So this particular report had the longest follow-up period of any BJS recidivism study, one which tracked them over 10 years. And it looked at more than 400,000 persons released in 24 states in 2008. And these states accounted for 69% of all persons released nationwide that year. So you see here a graph from the previous study, and as I mentioned, looking at the annual arrest percent, we saw that it went from 37% in year 1 to 26% in year 5. Looking at the 2008 cohort, we see a similar declining pattern between year 1 and year 5. And then continuing into the longer follow-up period, we see that that pattern also continues. So that by the year 10, the annual arrest rate was 22%, about half of what it was in year 1 at 43%. We also see that females had lower arrest rates than males for the entire 10-year follow-up period. Now we have other information on the annual arrest patterns broken down by different characteristics, and those are available in this 2008 release cohort report on the BJS website, which is bjs.gov. Now, BJS also conducted some analyses to look at how recidivism rates changed over time. And to do this, we looked at the rates among the 2012 release cohort and the 2008 cohort, which I just discussed, as well as a 2005 release cohort from a previous report. Now, specifically, we looked at, or we focused these analyses on the 19 states that these three reports or these three cohorts had in common. We see here among persons released in these 19 states, the percentage arrested for any type of offense within 5 years following release declined from 77% in 2005 down to 75% in 2008 and 71% in 2012. However, the percentage arrested within 5 years for a violent offense did not differ significantly. We see here it was 28% in 2005 and also 28% in 2012. We have a few more comparisons between these three cohorts, and those are available at the end of our 2012 release cohort report, again, on the website at bjs.gov. So now I'll turn things over to Anne.
Thank you. I apparently don't have my camera working, so I'm going to just be some disembodied voice. I'm going to talk today about employment of persons released from federal prison in 2010. We published a report on this in just this past December, and so there's a link. And we did this with members of the Census Bureau, and I will explain why. We were actually mandated by Congress to do a report in 2019 as part of the Defense Reauthorization Act. If you actually read through those laws, they stick a lot of other things in that they know have to get passed. And one of them was the Fair Chance for Jobs Act, which basically said that federal employers may not use criminal record or criminal history at the very first part of considering someone for a job. So they weren't allowed to use it then. They could theoretically use it later on, but it depended on the job. We were required to report to Congress about former people who had been involved in criminal activity by December of 2021, so we just made it, and then 5 years thereafter. We had to use external data sources to complete this report because BJS doesn't collect information on employment of people who are released from prisons or jails. We did at one point have a survey of former prisoners, but we have not done that in probably, 10 years. So we were going to have to use external sources. And so we started with the prison records, and we got an agreement with the Bureau of Prisons to take the people who were released in 2010 and then link those records to employment data that was housed at the U.S. Census Bureau. And that data is known as the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics, which I just say LEHD because it's a lot easier. It consists of data from state unemployment, insurance earnings, and there's a survey that they do called the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages. So basically what the Census Bureau has done is these are state level surveys, and they spent probably 10 years and at least that many millions of dollars to get a system together so that they have data for all states. And they can make that available to people to do linkage and study employment. This was sort of their first big combination of data linkage, and they have gone on from there to all sorts of other data sources. But this is a big one. And the data provide employment and earnings information for all persons who earned at least $1 in wages during a quarter. And these are standard quarters, so January to March and April to June, et cetera. Now, you would hope you'd earn more than $1 for 3 months, but that is sort of the base level that we're looking at. Basically, what we're doing is we're saying if we can't find you in these data, then you were not employed during that quarter. And they have demonstrated that, in fact, that is the case, that these people are not working if they are not in the LEHD data. So we have it for all 50 states from 2000 forward. And the data include dates of employment and earnings per quarter, and then employment sector. We chose a 2010 release cohort because the most recent employment data that Census had was 2015, and we wanted to be able to follow people for several years. So we took people who were released in 2010, and I first want to go over a couple, just quickly, characteristics of federal and state prisoners, because they are very different populations, and it's important to understand these differences in order to see how outcomes may be different in terms of employment. So this is the age distribution of federal prisoners, and it doesn't look that different. Typically, federal prisoners are 1 to 1.5 years older as a median, or about 2 years on average older than state prisoners. So it's not huge, but it can manifest in a number of ways. Federal prisoners also tend to have higher levels of education, so that may actually cause you to have a better chance of getting a job, theoretically. We can see that federal prisoners have a much lower percentage of non-Hispanic whites compared to state prisoners, and a higher percentage of Hispanics and non-Hispanic Blacks. The real difference comes when you look at offense distribution. So violent offenders are fairly rare in the federal system. Only about 8% of people who are in federal prison have been convicted of a violent offense. And a lot of those are coming into the federal system from the District of Columbia, which felons in DC go into the federal system. You'll notice that the biggest pot for federal prisoners is drug crimes, and these are 99.9% are trafficking. Okay? Public order, it's predominantly weapons, but also some immigration. So obviously there are going to be different people in the federal system than are in the state system, where almost 60% are in for violent crimes. So we took our data of 2010 release cohort, and that was 73,500 people. And first we had to actually, link these people and give them an identification number. And we could only do that with about 70% or about 51,000 persons. And we had to ask why. Well, the linkage for identification is based on Social Security number, okay? And of the 22,000 people who were released from the BOP in 2010 who couldn't be assigned a linking identification number, almost 98% were non-US citizens. So they probably didn't have a Social Security number, okay? So if they're not in the Social Security system, we're not gonna be able to assign an ID, and therefore we can't link it to the employment records. So we're certain that the reason that we had, this poor match rate, semi-poor match rate, 70%, was that, we were dealing with a population that had a large number of non-US citizens. Okay, so we've linked our data and we've identified our people and we have linked them to employment records. Now, I said that we're looking at quarters, and we're looking at people who were released during one of the quarters in 2010, okay? We didn't just say we followed everybody through 2014, okay? Because you may have been released in January while someone else was released in March and somebody else was released in December of 2010. What we did was we actually took the quarter you were released in, and that was called a free quarter, okay? So you could theoretically get a job during that quarter, but that was the quarter after release. It wasn't your first full quarter of eligibility. We followed you for 16 quarters, okay? Now that may have been in January of 2014 or December of 2014 when you ended, okay? Just all depended on when you got released. And so everyone got a full 16 quarters of follow-up. And so let's look at what we found. Like I said, there were 51,500 people that we were able to identify and link. The vast majority, obviously, are males. This measure, the percent ever employed. So at some point during those 16 quarters, even if it was just for a day, 67% were employed, okay? That basically means that 33% were not employed even one day in the 4 years after the quarter of release. Males have a slightly lower employment percentage than did females. Now, remember, we're looking at 16 quarters, and now this looks at the mean number of quarters employed, and it's basically 9, which, it's more than half of the 4 years that we're doing follow-up. The most interesting statistic for me was mean time to first employment, okay? So how long does it take before, once you get out of prison, to get a new job? And it's typically around 2 quarters to a little bit more. So half a year to find employment. The mean longest consistent employment, it's about 8 quarters, okay? So that suggests that at least for the majority of people who are working, they're sticking around. They're not necessarily, jumping in and out of jobs every quarter. And then we're going to break this down by race. And I should point out that AIAN is American Indian Alaska Native, and Asian includes Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders. And you can see these are very small and very small samples. So one thing that jumps out immediately is the percentage of Hispanics ever employed. That's very low compared to the other races. And we don't have a great explanation for that. On the other hand, Hispanics tend to work the most quarters. And in fact, if you go back down to the mean longest consistent employment, they had the longest consistent employment of all of the races. Whites had the highest, the lowest mean time to first employment, 1.8 quarters. Whereas, it looks like AIAN and non-Hispanic Black were out almost 3 quarters, which is 9 months, right? So again, it differed by race. And basically, while I said the thing about 67% had a job, that's, like I said, over 16 quarters. In no single quarter after release were more than 40% of persons from the study population employed, okay? So that may sound odd, but again, the people were not employed every single quarter, or most of them weren't. And so you had about 35, 36% employed during any one quarter. Females in the study population had a slightly higher percentage of persons employed in each of the 16 quarters, which makes sense given that they had a higher overall percentage. One of the interesting things we found was that drug offenders, former drug offenders who had been released in 2010, actually had the highest rate of employment once they were released from federal prison in 2010 compared to violent offenders or public order. And I saw a quick question in the Q&A that came up. What constitutes violent offenses? It's murder, kidnapping, rape, sexual assault, robbery, and I think that, and manslaughter. Okay, so negligent and non-negligent manslaughter. So, and assault, I'm sorry, I should say, both serious and simple assault. So that's what's in violent. Property offenders were the next best people in terms of employment over those 16 quarters. Similar results for race and ethnicity. Whites had a higher rate in each of the 16 quarters compared to the other races. And finally, we're going to look at this group, which is people who were held for less than a year by the time they were released in 2010, okay? So we broke this down into less than a year, 1 to almost 2 years, 2 to 2.9, 3 to almost 5, 5 to almost 7, et cetera. And then people who were in for 10 or more years. And what was really interesting was that there were a lot of people in the cohort of people who had served less than a year in the Bureau of Prisons before they were released in 2010. Now, that does not mean that they didn't necessarily serve time elsewhere beforehand, okay? And it was counted against their total sentence. But this is from when they were admitted to the Bureau of Prisons and then released in 2010. And they had, over all of the measures we looked at for employment, the absolute worst outcomes. They were employed at lower rates in each of the quarters and overall. They had the longest time to wait before they could get a job after they were released. They had the most number of jobs. They had the least, what am I trying to say? They had the least consecutive quarter period of job employment. So we don't actually know what the reason is behind this. And so the question is, we're going to have to go back and look at, are these younger people? Are they, were they not able to access the sort of programming that goes on that might prepare someone who had been in for longer for a job when they were released from prison? Are these predominantly drug offenders? Probably not, given the fact that they have poor employment outcomes. But again, we need to do more research into why those people are having a really hard time finding work. So yes, this is exactly what I just said. I didn't realize I had a slide in there. Median quarterly earnings. Now remember, this is over 3 months. So divide by 3 and you'll get a monthly salary. The median quarterly earnings in Q1 post-release was $3,500 compared to $6,000 in Q16. Okay, so $2,000 a month was the mean. Females employed in each quarter had lower quarterly earnings than did males, and you'll remember they were employed at higher rates, but they're earning less. In quarters 1 and 16, Hispanics, whites, and Asians who were employed had higher earnings compared to Blacks, American Indians, and Alaska Natives. And like I said, persons who served less than 1 year prior to their 2010 release earned at least $1,000 less per quarter than anyone who served longer. Those employed after serving time for drug and public order offenses earned about $6,000, $6,100 per quarter during quarter 16, which is about $1,300 more per quarter than people who had served time for violent offenses. And this is just graphically showing you the blue is Q1 and the red is quarter 16. So the positive here is that everyone's increasing in terms of how much they're making by quarter 16. The question is their ability to, live or support a family or what have you on that amount of money. But there you see whites and Hispanics and Asians. The report also looked at sectors of employment, and I didn't put that into this presentation simply because I was limited for time. It's not an easy explanation in terms of what sectors are taking people who have been sentenced and served time for crimes in the federal system. Typically, it's administrative, which can mean anything from an administrative assistant to someone who works as part of a temp agency, so they can be sent out to do whatever. It could include, any sort of administrative assistance in terms of, not just necessarily secretarial work, but other administrative jobs. There were also a large number of Hispanics, in fact, employed in building and construction, and that may be why their salary is higher than other races. So that is all in the report, and you can go ahead and look at that. And I'm going to turn this over to Danielle.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, so now that we've heard about a bunch of new releases, I'm going to share with you about a new data analysis tool that we just released at BJS, where you can analyze data on some of our prison collections. So this is, I'm not sure how many people have recently come to our website. It has been it's been revamped. Hopefully things are a lot easier to navigate and find. On this landing page, you'll see new releases and, you know, correctional populations just came out last week, which is very exciting. It merges all community corrections and institutional corrections into one report. And then for more detail, you can dive into some of the individual reports. So to access this new CSAT prisoners tool, the Corrections Statistical Analysis tool, we'll go into Data Analysis Tools, and pops up right here on the top, this Corrections Statistical Analysis tool for prisoners. If you had been to the site before, you may remember that we had a tool that was, you were able to look at data from the National Prisoner Statistics Program. And that collection is an aggregate data collection that collects data on race and sex of prison inmates, inmates held in private facilities and local jails, system capacity, non-citizens, and also persons 17 or younger. One of the benefits of this newly released tool is that it also includes data from the National Corrections Reporting Program, the NCRP. And what makes this prison collection different is that the NCRP collects offender level administrative data. So we have a whole slew of different cross tabulations that can be done with the NCRP being an offender level collection versus the National Prisoner Statistics Program, which is an aggregate collection from each of the state Department of Corrections. The NCRP collects data annually on prison admissions and releases, as well as year-end custody populations, and on parole entries and discharges in participating jurisdictions. Included in this collection is demographic information, conviction offenses, sentence length, minimum time served, credited jail time, type of admission, type of release, and time served for individuals. So in this new tool, there's a lot of fun new things. If you had been looking for NCRP data previously, you would need to go over to the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data. And we do release a public use file of selected variables for download at that archive. But sometimes, you know, managing through some of those files can be tricky. So this tool now incorporates that public use selected variable file into kind of a more user-friendly data query and tables and maps to look at a lot of different types of data. On this landing page, first you'll see some frequently requested figures. Some of these figures will be using data from NPS. So if you hover over this little info button, it'll tell you the source of where the data is coming from. So this prison admissions from 1978 through 2019 is coming from NPS. So it has data you can scroll through on national level admissions data over time for the federal and state prisons. all of these data are available for download. So you can download CSVs, you can download the image, just makes things a lot easier to navigate, which I think is really exciting, and we're happy to now have something easier to get through. Some additional frequently requested figures include the jurisdiction population, a private prison population, releases, admissions by offense. And so here where it says state prisons only, you hover over here, this is where it's coming, it's including data from the NCRP. So we can have those cross tabulations on individuals. We have % of sentenced prisoners under state jurisdictions by offense. So yeah, there's just a lot of great quick figures to examine here. Additionally, are the quick tables on this next tab. If you were familiar with the previous tool that had the NPS data, we always made these tables available. It is some of the most frequently requested data. So looking at jurisdiction by sex, custody population by sex, imprisonment rates going back to 1978. So all of these are available for a quick Excel download, which is really helpful. And these are all exactly the same as what was available in the previous tool. We wanted to make sure that some of that was easy to carry over into this new tool. Now, some of the really new stuff that we were able to incorporate are these map query and advanced query tabs. These are very neat and have so much data to look at. As you can see here from this drop down, you can look across time. As an example, I'm going to look at releases. So right now, this is just 2019 number of releases by state. So this is looking at just a single year of release data. And we can look at the total number, or we can look at rates. So clicking here, you can see changes, or you can see the rate for 2019 of total releases. Something very neat is we can look at percentage change over time. So here, this timeline now becomes interactive, and so we could look at 2010 to 2019. You just drag that across, and it populates total releases, percent change. I still have this rate clicked here, so this is by per 100,000 state residents, looking at change of time, or percent change of total releases from 2010 to 2019. Down here, there is a changing tool that you will see. This will change depending on what the maximum and minimum of these rates will be. If we just want to look at numbers, just click that rate, and it goes right back to looking at that just percent change. Always, you can choose to include footnotes. Let's see, we could look at private prisons, not do percent change. And you can pick a single year. Obviously, some of this, it depends on how much data we had. So private prison data goes back to 1999. If it's not available, it'll just be grayed out. For additional information and for source, you can always just hover over this info. So there's a lot of really cool things that can just be queried in this map tool. And I know that we always have, at BJS, we're constantly getting questions about, different states, and it's just really fun to be able to put something up here that I think is really useful. And once again, like all of this data, this is exportable. So when you see these 3 lines, you can click on it and you could download CSVs, you can download the graphic. There's a lot that can be done. The advanced query has a ton of customizable tables. There's 3 types of tables that can come out of this advanced query. We can look at annual counts of admissions, releases, and year-end populations coming from state and federal prisons. So this annual counts will come from the NPS, the National Prison Statistics Survey. Looking at annual counts, one of the examples we could look at is, let's say we'll look at the year-end population. We can look at both sexes, can look at the total year-end population, and then here you can choose jurisdictions. You could look at it nationally or for each state. So you could, if you have state-specific questions, just pull up one state. Let's look at all years and all states. And since this is a ton of information, sometimes it takes a little bit of time to pull up. I think sometimes on this sharing, there we go. So here we have all years from 1978 all the way through 2019 for all states for year-end population from the National Prisoner Statistics Survey. Exporting this, you'd have all the population data you would need. The second type of custom table that you can create here in this advanced query are characteristics of persons admitted to state prison, released from state prisons, or the year-end state prison population from the NCRP. So everything in this offender characteristics tab is going to be coming from the NCRP collection. Let's say we want to look at releases. We'll look at both sexes. My sharing of this is creating a little bit of a lag. Let's look at offense. And then look at all jurisdictions, and let's look at the most recent release data by offense. When looking at the NCRP by state, you'll get this little pop-up saying that we caution against making state-to-state comparisons in this tool, just because states have very different offender profiles. As noted here, some states have unified prison and jail systems, while other states only have offenders with a sentence of more than 1 year. Okay, so here we have by state the most serious offense releases of 2019. These types of queries, I think, are what at BJS we would get questions about most. So having this available now for download, I think is going to make it a lot easier for analyzing some of our data. And here in the advanced query, the last type of custom table will be looking at the year-end population, admissions, and releases at a national level, but from the NCRP. So this is where we see the methodology, but we're going to take the NCRP data and weight that up to the NPS totals. As an example, we'll click here on national characteristics. Let's look at the year-end population for both sexes. And here there are a ton of different variables that you can look at. Age at admission, highest level of education, maximum sentence length, the year of prison admission, as well as the year of mandatory release, parole eligibility, and projected prison release. As an example, we look at year of projected prison release, and we could look at that by offense. And we'll choose this most recent year, 2019. And so this starts back at 1950. So there isn't too much data until we get down into some of the future years. So we're looking at projected prison release. This goes all the way, I think it goes 100 years into the future. We cap it at 100 just because there's so few data points outside of that, and you don't want this running constantly. So you can look by most serious offense projected prison release as according to the NCRP collected in 2019, or for 2019. Once again, you can choose to include footnotes or not, and then this is, you can export all of these custom queries to Excel. Obviously, there's a lot of methodology behind some of these collections. So in this resources tab, hopefully any questions you may have would be answered in the methodology, the frequently asked questions, and then if needed, there's also a ton of supporting documents and links to those. The NCRP resource guide, all of this at the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data. So hopefully everyone finds this very useful. I know that I have already, and it's exciting to be able to put something new out, something with great visuals, and it's a bit more tangible and easy to use than I think our last tool, but it includes all of the same information with some additional information. So thank you very much for listening. And I think we have time now for some questions. So we'll dive into those. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks, Anne and Matt and Leonardo for excellent presentations. We did have a number of questions that came through, and so I'll just read them off, and then if the relevant party wants to jump in and take a swing, that'd be great. So we'll start off with the questions regarding the recidivism presentation. Chris asked, let me just expand this so I can read it. Did either study examine, either of the recidivism studies examined include recidivism of parents, dads and moms?
For those recidivism studies, we didn't have information on whether the persons had children or were parents. I also noticed we had a question about whether the persons released were married or single at the time. For these particular national studies, we didn't have that information. And I believe the same was true for the study that Anne talked about as well.
Yes, that's correct.
The next question is another good one. This came from George. He asked, to what extent does the report identify recidivism rates based on what reentry services are accessed and the duration?
So for the recidivism studies, we didn't have information on the reentry services that were available. I know there is some information that the corrections unit might provide just in terms of reentry services in general, but for this particular study, we didn't have that detailed information for the sample.
Thank you. They asked us to just to post a link in the chat, so we've linked to the tools and the reports in the chat, and then it's also available at bjs.gov, and I think AIR as well, and NRC have also linked to the various reports. So please do take a look, and if you have questions, we're happy to connect on those too. Okay, the next question is from Michael, and it's regarding the post-incarceration employment report. So the point that pulling info from the Department of Labor might miss a number of returning citizens that are 1099 or self-employed. So any statistical breakdown on the number that might not work for an employer, but choose to be self-employed once they return. And I think
right. Right. So we were looking at wages and earnings, okay? We did not, that does not include any money that may come through benefits or, state or federal benefits, VA or SNAP, TANF, WIC. And it does not include people who are self-employed if they have not, filed the paperwork to go through that. One of the other things we're looking at is IRS data. Now, the nice thing about the LEHD compared to the IRS is that it's quarterly, whereas the IRS is obviously once a year if you're using the 1040 or W-2 forms. So we wanted to look at it at a slightly finer grain. But yes, you do give up some of the sources of income that that you would probably get in the IRS data. We also don't get illegal income, and I'm guessing that that's also not in the IRS data, but maybe it is. We'll have to check that out and see.
And then as a follow-up to that, this came from Nicole, was there a location of release tracked to determine if this had any correlation to how much a person was earning? This one was geographical.
No, that was another thing that we will look at in the future. We do know that, this cohort, when they came out, they were sort of at the tail end of the Great Recession, but we don't think it was a big factor in unemployment. And yeah, I mean, we had very limited information from the BOP, so we didn't even have education level, which is going to be a really important predictor in terms of, being able to get a job. I think when we do this again, we're going to try to get things like, marital status or, the location they ended up prior employment in terms of, the sector and earnings, and as well as education. So yeah, I think you're right that, this is going to vary across the country.
Makes sense. I think you responded to Deanna's question, which was about whether or not we explored whether the men were married versus single upon release.
We don't know.
And then this is with regards to the areas of employment, so retail versus manufacturing.
Right.
That is all in the report, right? That
is all in the report, yes. And we used the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a standard set of sectors that they divide everything into, and so I have included descriptions of the top 5 that the prisoners or the former prisoners were employed in, but then also, I have links to the regular BLS site where you can go and look at the other types of sectors.
A lot of great questions from the audience, and we really appreciate those. Carol also asked whether we had data on any vocational rehabilitation training that occurred while incarcerated and the use of those educational programs, and so
no,
we didn't have that connection.
No, and I mean, I know a little bit about what the BOP provides, but obviously it's going to be different for everyone. One of the reasons I think the population that is that served the least amount of time is not doing particularly well is because they don't have access to those programs. So, for example, drug and alcohol treatment is not available to BOP prisoners until they are within 2 years of their release, okay? And I know for a fact that it's always sort of over, they have a wait list for just about every program. And so, you know, if somebody just comes in, what are their chances of getting a spot if there are people who have been waiting for years? I don't know. I don't know how they make these decisions. So that would be another thing to do is maybe get at some level of program participation, program success, and yeah.
Great ideas for next studies. Had a question about other places, if we knew of any other places to gather data on recidivism rates nationally, specifically for parents.
Yeah, currently, I don't think that information is available at the national level, but a really good resource for folks that are on this webinar would be from the Council of State Governments. They put out a 50-state report a few years ago, which provided some really helpful resources from each of the states and how they measure recidivism and how to find where their reports and statistics are. So I think there might be some information on that at the state level that could be available.
Thanks, Matt. To follow on to that, Melinda asked whether how trauma factors into these statistics, specifically the recidivism rate, and if that's looked into to see the correlation. So these questions about the individual characteristics of individuals within these larger national scale studies, which we just don't have access to that level of individual information yet. Is that accurate?
Right. Could you repeat the first part of that question again, Rich? I'm sorry.
Sure. It was just with regards to how the experience of trauma
right.
might have an impact on recidivism rates for individuals.
Yeah, I think what you said is correct there, of just not having that level of information for individuals for these two studies.
Okay. And then there was a question as well from Jennifer, just under the Bureau of Prisons, where the rehab, where is the rehabilitation for those with sex offenses? So that's we could direct you back to our Federal Justice Statistics Program reports at our website. We don't have any representatives directly from that group here today, but I'm quite certain that there's some there. Otherwise, if not us, one of our sister agencies, SMART, would be a good resource to take a look. Specifically, Jennifer, if you're interested in which of the facilities provide rehabilitation for those with individuals with sex offenses. And I think that is it, unless thank you, Adrian. There's one sex offender management program. So we have a question from Linda. Is there anything that probation officers do to help ensure the collection of accurate statistics, even from a county or state level? Danielle, are you still on? You're our resident probation expert.
Yes, yes, I am, but no. The answer to the question is no. Basically, it really varies widely from state to state on what types of community correction statistics are collected by agencies, by POs, and sent to the state or to us at DOJ trying to collect national statistics on community corrections. We have a hard time even getting the sex of people on probation. So if some of that information is being collected, it is usually not being sent to the state, and is definitely not being sent to us at the federal level. So I think that information would vary, like I said, widely state to state. And, you know, digging into some of the state reports, there might be some information, but not widely enough that I would know.
Okay, thank you. Did anyone see any questions that came in that we
I see a question, Rich. Somebody was asking, I think they were noticing that Indiana wasn't in the recidivism studies that were discussed, and the way that that worked in terms of states being included was having them report their prison release information through BJS's National Corrections Reporting Program, and needing to have the state identifiers to be able to collect the criminal history data. So that was one of the data elements that was needed to be included in the recidivism study.
All right, well, wonderful. And thank you again, everyone, for presenting, and to NRC and to BJA for having us, and to help to thank you all of those of you who were here and joined us today, and thank you for the work that you're doing in the community, and thank you for your interest in this important topic. And we look forward to seeing you out in the field, and as things begin to open up again and we're able to connect a little bit more directly in person, we're looking forward to that. And as always, you can always come to us and ask questions. Ask BJS is a great resource. Many of the statisticians on the line today respond directly to these types of questions through our press manager, and so we're always welcome your questions and your input, and we appreciate the work that you're all doing in all the different areas and sectors across this country. So thanks everyone. We appreciate it, and stay strong.